Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Michael Green, Senior Vice President and Japan Chair here at CSIS and a professor at Georgetown. Some distinguished, in fact, this audience is pretty much 100% distinguished as I look out. Quite an impressive audience. Thank you very much for coming. Before I begin, a few brief safety and security announcements, which we always do at gatherings of this size. I'm your designated safety officer in case of an emergency. You'll find the exits are back behind you, and you'll go down one floor, exit down through the stairwell, and we'll meet around the corner at National Geographic, which is just down left and left, should we have to. So CSIS today, together with the Japan Center for Economic Research, is delighted to host this discussion with three of Japan's leading lawmakers, statesmen, with particular expertise in national security, and to talk about our alliance in the years ahead. I'll introduce the other members of the panel in a moment, but let me first mention they're all here in Washington for the week as part of what's known as Golden Week, and to join discussions here and around town under the Mount Fuji Dialogue, which JCER runs, and my good friend Sunohara-san, and many of you are participants in that dialogue. The JCER cooperation with CSIS goes way back. We worked together on the Mount Fuji Dialogue. Last year in this room, Professor Akihiko Tanaka issued the JCER report on the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance, what they kindly called sometimes the Japan version of the Armitage-Nye report, which was a bipartisan effort to create a series of papers on the future vision for the alliance. Really a very strategic and coherent and actionable blueprint for the alliance from the leading experts that were brought together by JCER. Joining us today are three of the regulars in the Mount Fuji Dialogue, three of the most important contributors to the U.S.-Japan alliance of recent years. To my immediate left is Gen Nakatani. He is a member of the House of Representatives from Kochi Prefecture. He served as defense minister from 2014 to 2016, was deeply involved in the debate on security legislation, new interpretations of Article 9 of the Constitution, defense policy reforms, and defense guidelines. He's a former member of the Ground Self-Defense Forces and a graduate of the National Defense Academy. And I'm sure when he graduated and was a second lieutenant and he showed up at U.S.-Japan security meetings with the name Gen Nakatani, people were a bit confused. But I'm sure his rapid promotion and success is entirely due to merit and not his first name. Sitting in the center is another former defense minister, Itsunori Onodera. A member of the lower house from Miyagi Prefecture. We hosted Minister Onodera here in July 2014 for the first real description of the Abe administration's defense policy and thinking about Asia and the U.S.-Japan alliance. I think it made a big impression. Onodera-san is a graduate of Tokyo University. Sitting all the way on your right is Akihisa Nagashima. Nagashima-san has had a very interesting 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, he was a member of the Democratic Party of Japan. And now he's a member of the Akihisa Nagashima Party of Japan. That's not the real title, but he's moved independent, which we might ask him about. He is deeply knowledgeable about security strategy, having studied at CSIS with me and graduated from Keio University. He served last in government as the Special Advisor and National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Noda, and served before that as State Minister for Defense. So each of our guests is going to give a brief 5 to 10 minute opening statement. I think Minister Nakatani is going to speak about his recent experiences as defense minister and assess where we are on defense guidelines collective self-defense, and other national security reforms. Onodera-san is leading within the LDP a task force on missile defense, and both gentlemen will talk about North Korea, but Onodera-san in particular about what we do as allies to deal with it. Nagashima-san is going to give a sort of grand strategy view of how Japan is facing the array of challenges and working with the Trump administration. So gentlemen, you can use this podium if you like, or stay at your seat. Maybe the podium is a good idea for the opening statement. So if you could join me in welcoming former Defense Minister Nakatani.
Good morning. My name is Gen Nakatani, and I was a former minister of the Defense Ministry. However, I was not former general. About 2 years ago, during Golden Week, there was a Jewish-Japan summit, the meeting held, and at that time, it was decided that the Japan-U.S. The defense guideline would be revised. Subsequently, security legislations were discussed in the Diet, and this legislation passed the Diet, and former defense, the Secretary, the Ashton Carter, was my counterpart, and we worked together a lot. And the Commander Dolan and the Darren, the Lieutenant, the General, the Darren, are playing a very important role in Japan with respect to the security. A year ago or so, we had the major earthquake in Kumamoto, and U.S. Forces dispatched Osprey and provided food and other essential materials to those who were suffered from earthquakes. Currently, the situation in Northern Peninsula, the most tense the situation we are facing since Korean War. And last year, more than 20 times ballistic missiles were launched, and the nuclear tests were conducted twice. And on February 12th this year, new solid fuel was used, and then also in March, 4 the missiles were launched simultaneously, and 3 out of 4 landed in EEZ of Japan. And in April, the 5th missile was launched. However, this was failed. Particularly, Carl Vinson, U.S. aircraft carrier, getting nearer at this time. In spite of that, missile was launched. Currently, we are investigating the reasons why it was failed. However, that was the intermediate range missile, so it's a very provocative and a very threatening behavior by North Korea. Who could stop such development by North Korea? And the ultimate goal of North Korea is to maintain Kim Jong-un regime by holding a nuclear weapon. They try to warn against the United States and try to preserve their regime. So nuclear development and maintenance of regime are inseparable. So in exchange of position and life, that they are acting, and they are almost, the Kim Jong-un is almost stepping on the tail of the Japan, and I do not believe there is no chance for making progress in the negotiation. On short-term basis, for a while, they may refrain from nuclear test and missile launch. However, long-term basis, it's possible that they develop nuclear the missile which could reach the mainland of Japan. That would increase the threat. if they were to give up or abandon the development of a nuclear weapon and the others, that would lead to the collapse of the regime, so that probably would not happen. So if such the long distance the missile were to be developed, that would be the real threat to Japan, to the United States. So we currently need to put all the options available, including the military option. They are suggesting that the possibility of first strike. So it is, if they were to continue the development, it's possible that the North Korea would implode. Currently, the Key Resolve and Fall Eagle, those exercises are being conducted jointly between United States forces and the South Korea. And then those exercises are being conducted having in mind O-Plan 5030 and 5015 and 5027. So they are exercising the joint, the special the forces, and the possibility of first strike, and the simulation of the command structure. So they are moving a convention near the Korean Peninsula. And the escort ship is capable of having 14 helicopters, and they can monitor the behavior of the submarines of the enemy countries. And the escort ship Sazanami is in the Tokyo Bay and try to escort the refueling the vessels which deliver fuels to U.S. fleet.
Together with me, I have Mr. Maihara, the member of the Democratic Party. 6 years ago in Washington, D.C., at the time of giving a speech then, Mr. Maihara, the self-defense forces, together with that, the other countries, the armed forces, in order to protect them, the new security registration was needed. What he mentioned 6 years ago in D.C., and Mr. Maihara, the member of the lower house, I think that was quite right approach. And together with the self-defense forces, the United States, when they act together, it is quite natural for SDF to protect U.S. forces, and this is a common sense in the world. And for the Japanese defense, it is very much needed. So 2 years ago, the security registration was established, and within that, for the protection of the U.S. forces, the protection of the arms of the U.S. forces, etc., became possible. So the training has been conducted between the two the armies, and for the provocation and reckless activities with the deterrence, we try to deter the acts of North Korea. In 2001, when I was the head of the defense the department, when the 9/11s took place, from the carrier Kitty Hawk, when it left the Tokyo Bay, together with maritime self-defense forces and Japanese the Coast Guard, they tried to actually stay around the carrier. And that was under the name of research and study, not for the protection. But now we have a solid the legal structure to do this. And about that, I think Mr. Onodera will be explaining after. But detection, interception, and the response capability, and all those capabilities should be acquired by Japan, and Japan should make efforts. And the launch of the warning satellite will be necessary. That is included in the proposal. And between the ISL, the methods should be solidified between the two countries. And what happens to China? And Trump, the President Trump, with President Xi Jinping, they seem to talk with each other over the phones. But currently, China is tested by United States in many ways, and China is expected by the rest of the world. And whether they're able to give up the nuclear missile development of North Korea, if that cannot be done, the preemptive strike of the United States will be approved, and therefore the China's response is of significant importance, and therefore not the preemptive strike to happen. I think the Chinese must do their best efforts. And about Japanese response, guideline and the security registration should be exercised. And with our deterrence capability, we should contribute to the peace and stability of the East Asia. On top of that, we have to rescue the Japanese at the time of contingency outside Japan. And also, we really have to protect by using J-alert. And for the security legislation, the opposition party pointed out the gray zone issues. In other words, the protection of the gray zone. And about that area, the solid response is necessary. We are going to have Olympic Games and Paralympic Games 3 years from now, and terroristic attacks happen everywhere in the world. So under such circumstances, the counter-terrorist the measures, and we do have activities, very effective activities for international security and gray zone response must be studied. Japan and US should study, and so ACM, and that is Alliance, the coordination mechanism, that should work, and BPM, that is the operational the action plan, and they should be formulated in advance in a very solid manner so that we're able to be ready for whatever the situation it may come in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Onodera, and I think this is the second or third time I'm given this opportunity. And before Mr. Nakatani for 2 years, I served as a defense minister. Currently, I'm in charge of the policy making of security within LDP, and this time the missile defense, we put together the proposal and submitted to the Prime Minister Abe, and the paper has been already distributed to you for your reference. And about North Korea issue, what we are really concerned about is that that was the 7th of April last month, the 4 the Scud ELs were launched by North Korea. And they actually launched it towards the Sea of Japan. And 4 Scud ELs, the purpose of their launch was explained by North Korea. And they said that that was intended to attack the U.S. forces operating in Japan, and that was already transportable, the launcher. And among the new the missiles, some of them use solid fuel, and the test is conducted to launch it from the submarine, and that means the missile capability of North Korea becomes quite high, and we never know that when and from where the missiles will be launched. And already the 5 nuclear tests were conducted by North Korea. And if you look at the examples of the countries, other countries, the 5th the nuclear test, well, the miniaturization of the nuclear arms comes to a very close to completion, and therefore that can be taken as a major threat to Japan. So in order to protect from the ballistic missile, together with the United States, we do have anti-ballistic missile defense. That is FM-3 from the Aegis, and the PAC-3, this is the ground-launched. And with this, the ballistic missile defense can be possible. But what is difficult is unlike before, 24 hours, 365 days, when the North Korea is going to launch. That never knows. And therefore, we do need to have a lot of the readiness. And therefore, just the response by Aegis would not be enough. And I think this is a case of Romania, and the Aegis Ashura type was actually deployed. And so that kind of the mechanism should be introduced to Japan. At high altitude, that the deployment would be needed in Japan. I think that kind of argument has been already conducted. In other words, the diplomatic the response alone cannot stop North Korea's nuclear and missile development. And therefore, current missile defense capability with the cooperation from the United States should be enhanced in Japan. And that is included in our proposal.
これは戦後の
Yes, and after the World War II, we introduced the idea which would transform our policy. That is the idea of possible counterattack to enemy bases. Our policy is to defend ourselves. That is it. So basic is if attacked, we will defend ourselves. However, we would not possess equipment that would attack enemies. So with that policy, we were able to defend our country. If the bombers that came to Japan and dropped bombs in Japan, then just the fighters and the ground to the air missiles can be used to counterattack. And then if large war vessels came near Japan and shoot cannon to burn some of the cities in Japan, that we can counter that using very capable the submarines. And so forth. However, if the situation around Japan is changing, even North Korea, in order to attack Japan, they are thinking about using the ballistic missiles. If the ballistic missiles were to be launched from the North Korea against Japan, it only takes a little over 10 minutes. So with cooperation with the United States, that we have a missile defense system in place. However, what worries us is the missile defense requires very high technological capability. So if there are so many missiles coming one after other, there will be a limit as to the capability of us the defending. So we really need to counterattack so that we can neutralize by neutralizing enemy's base. So for the first time in history, we made reference to the counterattack capability, whether or not Japan should possess such a capability. That's including in that recommendation. Under the alliance, the counterattack, as far as counterattack is concerned, U.S. is supposed to respond in such a way. However, North Korea's capability is getting higher in order to enhance the deterrence. We think that both Japan and the United States, both of them should have the capability of the counterattack. So our the policy is to defend ourselves only, and that policy will continue. However, the way enemies attack us has been changing because of advancement of the technology. So we would not do first strike. However, if we are attacked, in order to prevent second and third attack, we feel that we need to own such capability. Of course, that has to be done with coordination and cooperation with the United States, and we're not thinking the possibility of Japan alone counterattack. However, we should consider having such kind of capability and equipment. We feel lots of tension with respect to the behavior by North Korea, and the North Korea's intention is to attack U.S. forces bases located in Japan, and even though that is a direct attack, it's not a direct attack against mainland United States, but that should be considered as attack to the United States as well as to Japan. We really should further enhance our cooperation between two countries and to deal with such threat. And what's most important is the efforts in the area of diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Aki Nagashima, the fifth-term member of the House of Representatives of Japan. I'm really delighted to be here at the CSIS to speak about Japan's strategy, security strategy for the Trump administration. Since I became independent 2 weeks ago, I have been fully enjoying the freedom of speech. Since the C-SPAN is broadcasting this event, let me make my presentation in English for the sake of American viewers. My presentation is a brief presentation today. I'll try to focus on 3 issues. First, I'd like to talk about the Trump administration's foreign policy. Next, I'm going to give you my quick overview of the strategic dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region. And finally, I present some proposals to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance to deal with those dynamics in the region. First, Trump administration's foreign policy. During the presidential campaign and the initial phase since the inauguration, there are a wide spectrum of concerns shared among Japanese Diet members and intellectuals about Trump administration's foreign policy. We encountered a series of unknowns of the new administration since its campaign promises did not echo traditional foreign policy foundations of U.S. Republicans. The America First foreign policy, for example, has been widely viewed as the U.S. retrenchment from being the vanguard of the liberal international order, especially U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the preference of the bilateral negotiations that emphasize the benefit of American workers created doubts on U.S. leadership on rule-based, open, and inclusive economic order in Asia-Pacific. President Trump's own conviction for U.S. allies that needs to pay fair share has also been interpreted as if the alliance could also be a part of his deal, ahead of mentioning the value of an enduring commitment to peace and stability through strengthening the alliance. But actually, the first 100 days of Trump foreign policy amended many of doubts mentioned above. The summit meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe at Mar-a-Lago reiterated the U.S. firm commitment to the U.S.-Japan alliance and thus provided an assurance to the U.S. allies in the region. Appointments of Rex Tillerson, General James Mattis, and General H.R. McMaster as key members of its national security team witnessed that the United States resides far from isolationism, but remains firm on active engagement. Peace through strength, the leading concept of the foreign policy of the Trump administration, is also at play in Asia, especially to deal with North Korea. The United States demonstrates large-scale force presence off the Korean Peninsula, while requesting China to play the pivotal role to tighten economic sanctions, thus to restrain North Korea's path to continue modernizing nuclear weapon and long-range missile capabilities. Trump administration's proposed budget outline to increase the military spending, as well as to modernize major equipment, to fortify force readiness, and to invest in future technology, would give good prospects for more promising U.S. defense strategy that reassure allies in Asia and Europe. Next, I'm going to give you a quick overview of critical challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. In the past several years, Tokyo and Washington have worked together with tremendous efforts to manage ever-changing strategic dynamics of the region. In 2015, as Nakatani-san mentioned, we upgraded the U.S.-Japan defense guidelines, followed by the comprehensive national security legislation, to provide outlines of the operational scope of the alliance and legal platform to further enhance the more integrated bilateral operations. As such, the U.S.-Japan alliance has been in good shape, and I have a lot of positive view on the current status. However, the alliance needs to have a constant update, without which it can easily dilute from emerging geostrategic shocks that we will face in coming years. First and foremost, the rise of China. According to CIPRI, Chinese defense budget exceeded Japan's in 2004, now spends 4.6 times bigger, and most likely it would become 6 times in 2020, more than 10 times bigger in 2030. So we should bear in mind these statistics. We have to squarely face with the new logic of the alliance management, where Japan's relative power will likely become constantly inferior to China, and its gap is increasingly widening. Next, North Korea. Its nuclear and missile program remains to be most immediate and actual threat to our national security. So I agree to what the Trump administration is pursuing. That is the so-called two-phase strategy, of which on the first phase, placement of additional economic sanctions on North Korea, where we urge China's serious implementations. Then on the second phase, to include all necessary means to pressure Pyongyang. I think this is the right approach to go beyond strategic patience. Nevertheless, Tokyo and Washington need to consult further on the exit strategy of current standoffs. All concerned parties, including China and Russia, are committed to the denuclearization as a common strategic goal. This is a great asset that 5 parties need to retain. However, Tokyo may disagree if temporary tension reduction is produced by North Korea's freeze on nuclear tests and ICBM deployment, with alleged secret deals struck by Washington, Beijing. When we talk about the red line, from Tokyo and Seoul's perspective, it has already been crossed since a long time ago. What we need here is an alliance strategy of long-term containment vis-à-vis North Korea, with maintaining constant strategic superiority in every domain. North Korea's current objective is to be recognized as a nuclear-armed state with deterrent capability against U.S. intervention. Therefore, they repeatedly contended that the six parties talks is dead, and thus Pyongyang would not abide by the joint statement in September 2005. Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul need to decisively deny North Korea's objectives by maintaining full-spectrum dominance against North Korea, to forcefully make them recognize that their pursuit of deterrence against us will never be achieved. This is probably the only way that North Korea would seek serious negotiation for the security guarantee. Lastly, let me offer some proposals for addressing agendas to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. First, the alliance needs to further materialize seamless bilateral responses, especially joint response to gray zone challenges as a low end of conflict, as well as ensuring operational credibility under the so-called A2AD environment in the medium to high-end conflict should be highlighted. In the gray zone, of course, Japan has the primary responsibility to deal with. We will enhance ISR capabilities and operations, mobile deployment of light armored units, and amphibious operation capabilities, based on the seamless and phased joint operations among Japanese Coast Guard, maritime, ground, and air self-defense forces, and U.S. Force Japan. We also need to further enhance U.S.-Japan defense cooperation for high-end operations under the A2AD environment. To that end, I believe it is necessary to come up with the U.S.-Japan joint concept on project power despite anti-access and area denial challenges. The term used by U.S. Defense Strategic Guidance in 2012. Moreover, Japan needs to dramatically increase the resiliency of critical defense platforms and assets. We should not let China neutralize the U.S. forces in theater operation. Measures including fighter-based air defense, ballistic and cruise missile defense, hardening of facilities, including underground, tactical dispersion among multiple in-theater bases must be highlighted. Second, the U.S. allies and partners in Asia need to enhance security cooperation among themselves. I have long been a proponent of a host region support concept, in addition to the current set of the host nation support of each ally, to strategically ensure U.S. forward presence in this region, as well as to facilitate region-wide operational support, close cooperation among key allies, including Korea and Australia, and Southeast Asian partners, based on the host region support network across the region under Japan's leadership is vitally important to develop. Japan and the United States together with the regional partners would also need to ramp up the capacity building of littoral states in Southeast Asia, namely the Philippines and Vietnam. As the maritime route-based order is constantly challenged in the South China Sea, a rapid force development to enhance their maritime domain awareness capability and to facilitate common operating picture to counter coercive behaviors of the Chinese naval power remain to be high priority. I will stop here and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to each of you for concise and precise observations on the challenges and responsibilities on us as allies going forward. I'm going to ask a few questions of our distinguished statesmen on the stage and then open it up for your questions in a moment. First off, Aki, I appreciated what you said about the two-staged approach to North Korea, pressure and then diplomacy, because like you, I am skeptical that we're going to get very much out of diplomacy. I actually wrote the first memo creating the six-party talks when I was on the NSC staff, and there was some hope, but I think experience has taught us all that we cannot expect even a renewed effort at pressure will change Kim Jong-un's calculation that he has to keep nuclear weapons, and that a freeze or temporary agreement could actually do more harm than good if it undermines deterrence and the credibility of our extended deterrent in particular. So your comments, Aki, and others by Onodera Sensei and Nakatani Sensei all raise one question I want to ask the panel. Aki, you said we have to be prepared for a collective effort to contain the North Korean nuclear program. And then you mentioned your study on host regional support. The idea that the region should share the responsibility, but also decision-making about U.S. forward presence. There's been talk of bringing back the so-called Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, India quadrilateral security cooperation forum that Prime Minister Abe had once proposed. And of course, in all of this, especially North Korea, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, has a critical role. And I believe I'm correct that when Maehara-san was foreign minister, the US, Japan, and ROK came very close to agreeing to a statement that would have been collective security. An attack on any of us is an attack on all of us. And that never actually became public. But we have all these different recent examples with the Quad, with movement towards some US, Japan, ROK collective security statement, with federated defense, which we study here. All the pieces are there, but we haven't done any of it. So the first question is, are we at a stage now, especially with North Korea, where the US and Japan and others need to think about some kind of deeper collective security arrangement? Probably not NATO, but something different from what we've done in the past. So Aki, since you raised this question, why don't we start with you and give us your thoughts on whether we need to move from the bilateral hub and spokes alliances we have to something closer to collective security arrangements in Asia.
Yeah, 日本語で。
In Asia, we need to deepen the security arrangement. In order to do so, particularly given the situation in Korean Peninsula, strategic tie between Japan and South Korea need to be tightened and strengthened. Whether or not this could be achieved politically, and I think that's the very important point. We've been continuing 2+2 with the United States for a long time, and we anticipated that we are going to have a 2+2 with South Korea, but it didn't happen, and now we have 2+2 with Australia and then even with Russia, but it hasn't happened with South Korea. And currently that we are experiencing very tense situation vis-a-vis North Korea. We always enjoy good relationship between Japan and the United States and South Korea. But I think this is a good opportunity for Japan to further the cooperation with South Korea, and then we should add Australia and the India. In 10 years, the $7.5 billion investing that money, strengthening the presence of the United States in Asia Pacific. That was proposed in the United States, and I am looking to see how this would develop. And in Japan, if the Trump administration asks Japan to further build up our defense capability or increase the budget for the defense, then defense budget could be raised up to 1.2% of GDP. And then the additional the budget can be used to increase the accessibility and increase the infrastructural the capability to support U.S. presence. By doing so, I believe that Japan should take leadership in structuring or the network in Asia. The first, I would like to talk about relationship with South Korea. When the missile was launched by North Korea, and that was considered as the exercise to attack U.S. bases in Japan. So they shot the missiles, so they wanted to demonstrate that they could simultaneously attack several different bases in Japan. United States has responsibility to defend the South Korea as well as Japan. And I really would like the South Korean politicians and public to understand that in order for the security for the South Korea, Japan also has responsibility in that respect. I would like to talk about my personal view about North Korean situations. What worries me most is how Trump administration would face North Korea. China definitely had some influence over North Korea. However, if you look at the recent relationship between China and North Korea, that would give me some doubts. For example, that Secretary Tillerson had a meeting with President Xi. North Korea had an ICBM test. When Vice President Pence was touring Asia, North Korea conducted the ballistic missile test. It seems to me that North Korea is not that concerned about China. And Kim Jong-un has been in power in the last 5 years, but he hasn't been abroad at all, and he hasn't gone to China either. And currently, and then in the past, the president of China had the North Korea's the president, and then they had a new president of the United States. However, the President Xi had the meeting with President Trump before he had the meeting with Kim Jong-un. So I do not believe it's easy to make the nuclear development stop. even China exerted more pressure. Once China stopped providing oil to North Korea, however, and then that triggered a six-party talk. However, even though North Korea did not receive oil from China, it's possible it could get oil from Russia. So I have some worry about the impact of the sanction to be imposed by China. So the question here is how the Trump administration would deal with this.
ミサイルを
So launched the missile to Syria, and in Afghanistan, the mother bomb was used, and the carrier was deployed in Japan. So in other words, very the strong posture by Trump administration. And even with that, if the North Korea continues to engage in the missile and nuclear development, what would be the next step of Trump administration? Whether they will continue try to be patient like the previous administration does, or if the North Korea does not respond, the further steps will be taken by the Trump administration. So their approach, Japan needs to pay a lot of attention to the next step by the Trump administration. So Japan-U.S. alliance from bilateral to multilateral, that is for the North Korea, the East Asia, the security. This is very important. And in Shangri-La, the East Asia Defense Ministers meeting is held regularly. This is a very effective forum. And Japan, U.S., the South Korea, and also including the Japan, U.S., and Australia, the triangle or trilateral meetings take place. And Japan, U.S., the Korea, three-country trilateral meeting is held. Between Japan and South Korea, there are many other issues. However, with this trilateral Japan, U.S., South Korea, things became more smooth in many ways. For instance, GSOMIA, the between Japan and South Korea, very difficult to implement. But with the involvement of United States, GSOMIA could be concluded. And therefore, when the missile is launched, momentarily, the three countries, Japan, U.S., and South Korea, can share the information immediately. I think that is an important milestone. And when for 5 years, we could not hold the top defense talk between Japan and Korea. But with a trilateral Japan-Korea, the defense leaders meeting was held. And therefore, I think that has given a very good impact. And so ACM, Japan between United States, we do have alliance, the coordination mechanism. But within three countries, I think that kind of similar mechanism, maybe the working level, military to military, and the higher, the SOM level, I think we should increase and enhance the relations among three countries between Japan, U.S., and South Korea. And so United States has a lot of important role to play. And so other than the security area, we are able to provide support to the rest of the world. And for the situation critically impacting Japan or the survival threatened, the Japan is able to provide support to United States. And AXA with Australia, the arrangement was already made, and therefore both the survival is threatened and the critically Japan is impacted. Well, actually, from bilateral to multilateral, Australia is involved, and India, as you know, the Indian Ocean. When you consider the importance of sea lane and the cooperation with India is critical because of the sea lane. In our anti-piracy, the Japanese the forces are active in Djibouti, and the countries which support and sponsor the terrorism, how to introduce the counter-terrorism and the ship inspection. Well, I think the multilateral approach is more effective, and therefore for the sea lane, for maritime, the security, multilateral security, the mechanism should be enhanced and developed.
Administration, it seems that there is a consensus that in Donald Trump's first term, North Korea will develop some kind of ICBM capability, a missile and a warhead that could potentially hit the United States. Whether it's demonstrated, whether it works, will remain questions, but there will be some kind of new threat in the coming years. And this has raised concerns about what is called decoupling, the idea that the US would not maintain its nuclear umbrella over Japan or Korea because it is now directly threatened. This is not new. In the Cold War, Francis de Gaulle asked, would you trade New York for Paris? When the Soviets developed that capability, and the US forward presence and nuclear umbrella didn't change. In many ways, it was strengthened. But it's understandable these concerns would come up now that we face a situation where the US homeland could possibly be hit directly by a missile. In your comments, I heard a little flavor, maybe, of concerns about decoupling. So Aki, for example, you said it would not be good if the US and China arranged some freeze with North Korea that maybe temporarily halted the ICBMs, but kept the missiles that target Japan and Korea not only in place, but developing. So that would be an example of some decoupling concern. And Onodera-san talked about the counterstrike capability, presumably some kind of surface-to-surface missile, emphasizing it should be within the US-Japan alliance. But I think many people in the US would say, from a requirements standpoint, the US doesn't need new counterstrike capability. So that's also political or geopolitical or symbolic and not just military. So could all three of you give our audience a sense of how serious the concern is in Japan, public, diet, government, about decoupling? Is the Onodera sense, is this study of a counterstrike capability just a kind of study, or is this a real development, a real requirement Japan will probably push? And should we be worried about this in Washington and paying attention to make sure that our extended deterrent, our nuclear umbrella, is as credible as possible? じゃあ小野寺さんからでよろしいですか。
もちろん日米同盟
But with regard to Japan-US alliance, for North Korea, the anti-strike, the capability, I think we have a full trust in that. For instance, ballistic missile, if the ballistic missile is launched against Japan, and with the missile defense that is intercepted, and second and third launch will continue. And in order to the stop from happening, we need to have a response. So in other words, readiness is needed. In other words, ready response is needed. Counterattack is needed. And so our response capability, the main the means is in Hawaii and Guam. The bombing from the bases in Hawaii and Guam would be the major one. But it may take time, and therefore on our part, we need a readiness. And in order to keep the second and third launch from coming, with the cooperation of the United States, we do need to enhance our capability, and we need to enhance our safety. So Japan has a role to play. And among all the countries in the world, when the country is attacked, we do have a self-defense, but by preventing ourselves from preventing the other side from launching the attack again. I think Japan is a country which does not have that capability. Of course, does not mean that we engage in war, but when the second attack is carried out by the enemy, we do have the capability of self-defense to keep our enemy from doing so. And I think that is the constitutional, and that is our interpretation interpretation of the Constitution. And what we have to do at the government, and for LDP, we made a proposal to the Prime Minister about this, and the Prime Minister accepted that proposal. And there, within the collaboration between Japan and the United States, I think that we do need to enhance our capability.
当初トランプ大統領が
With regard to the decoupling, that's something we worried so much prior to the inauguration of the Trump administration, because the President Trump said that America first and America is more important. So we just wonder what would happen, what their engagement in East Asia. However, after the President Trump became president, the first summit that he had that was with Prime Minister Abe, and through playing golf, they established a very friendly relationship, trust, based on trust. And Secretary Mattis and the Secretary Tillerson, both of them came to Japan soon after they were appointed to the positions. And I understand that General McMaster has a lot of understanding and knowledge about Japan. So strategically, the importance is. I think that this is the time where we really have to discuss the strategic importance between Japan and the United States. So we will need to shoulder to assist this alliance, and then we really should play the role in a responsible manner, and those needs to be worked out. The counterattack against enemy's base, it really has to do with Japan's security. So whether or not that we can completely secure our safety by relying upon the United States. And currently, the information that gets around very quickly, and UAV, that could be utilized, and also the information could be shared between allies. And based on that, they can divide the responsibility. So the arm and shield, which one will be responsible for providing shield, and which one is responsible for providing arm. I think those need to be clarified, and we should discuss more about doctrine. And other weapons, the biological, chemical weapons, we really need to prevent proliferation of such dangerous weapons. So CTBT, that is the system to manage such situation, and we need to impose sanction if it's violated. So by providing the deterrence, we continue to preserve peace. The flexible the deterrence strategy, and as part of it, Kitty Hawk was mobilized, and then we really need to give the very strong support to that. As far as decoupling discussion has been going on for a long time among experts, particularly vis-à-vis Europe, and Japan is now facing such situation. And current situation in North Korean Peninsula are the media, the communication become very intense, and I think Japanese public become very worried and concerned. So that discussion has become so heated. So really need to maintain calmness. We rely Japan on nuclear deterrence, and in spite of such tense situation, there is not much Japan can do. We either ask Japan, United States do, and then United States and China that discuss the things to work things out, and there is not much role to be played by Japan. So it's a kind of awkward situation. So I think that this kind of discussion needs to be done very seriously in political level. Of course, the counterattack capability, I think the possessing such capability is necessary. However, I think that defense cooperation between Japan and the United States has to be conducted in various different levels. For example, that's by sharing information, we can determine in where to launch the counter interceptor missiles. So by having lots of the layers of cooperation would further strengthen Japan and the United States.
You can direct it to a member up here or broadly. Yeah, right up front here.
Thank you. Leo Bosnia, retired FEMA, currently teaching disaster preparedness in Japan. Thank you all for an excellent presentation. My question is regarding, in the terrible event, if there were an attack on Japan, there will be a large number of civilian casualties who will require humanitarian assistance. The Japan Self-Defense Force and the U.S. military worked together wonderfully 6 years ago after the tsunami and earthquake in eastern Japan. So my question is, given the dangers of an enemy attack, are the Self-Defense Force and U.S. military planning and working together on how to provide large-scale humanitarian help in the future if needed? And is this planning going to include working with the civilian authorities for disaster relief in Japan? Thank you.
はい、どなたでもいいですから。
はい、これも
I think more than 10 years ago, we passed the contingency law, and in it, there is a law regarding protection of the citizens. At the time of contingency, how to protect the lives of the citizens. And even at a municipal level, all the plans are being prepared. When the missile that was launched, actually evacuation exercise was conducted in Akita Prefecture. Of course, U.S. forces in Japan will act together with us, and we need to consider the possibility of receiving support from U.S. forces, and at the time of Tomodachi operations, a very effective support was provided by the U.S. forces. So we would like to continue conducting exercise based on plan. At the time of the East earthquake, I was one of the people affected by this earthquake, and I actually saw with my own eyes how much the support was provided by U.S. the forces. I think at the time of such a disaster, I think that U.S. support is very critical, and if attack was made, and we need the support. But what's important is prevent such attack. And for that, we really need diplomacy and missile defense. And we have the system called J Alert. If North Korea actually comes to Japan, immediately Japanese government, the central government, would send alert to the municipal governments, and the municipal government is going to issue alert all over, and then also we receive such alert by mobile phones. However, it will only take a few minutes for the missile to launch, so we really need to figure out where to evacuate people and then providing shelters. And I think the relief of the affected people is very, very important.
Using guideline 20 years ago between Japan and the United States, this has been discussed. And after that, about the assumption of this kind of emergency, the program had been updated constantly. And of course, between the ROK and United States, because they're allied forces, how to evacuate non-combatants, I think there has been a lot of the programs updated. But between Japan and South Korea, as far as I know, between Japan and South Korea, the Japanese or non-combatant in Seoul, how jointly evacuate them and send them to overseas. I think there is not much discussion and plan formulated between the two governments yet. And therefore, at this moment, unless we do that seriously, unforeseen situation could happen at any time. And therefore, the information sharing is something we really have to improve. But the saving of the evacuees, and I think that is a very important starting point for us to conduct a discussion between Japan and South Korea. And in that process, the United States has a lot of important role to play. When the Japanese evacuated from the Korean Peninsula, when the U.S. forces or U.S. Carries out evacuation, Japanese the nationals may join. And so I think between Japan and U.S. also the adjustment and coordination is needed.
Scott Harold from the Rand Corporation. Gentlemen, thank you very much. In recent years, traveling to Japan, one often hears that Japan's concerns for security have primarily centered on China, whereas many Japanese perceive the United States was more worried about North Korea. Based on your comments today, it sounds like you have now changed your perspective on the ranking or ordering of the threat. First, could you comment, is that accurate? Is that driven by the recent missile tests that were explicitly by North Korea described as targeting Japanese basing? Second, given that the administration is prioritizing working with China to address this threat, in years past, Japanese have been very worried that Japan might be bypassed by the United States in favor of working with China in order to address regional and global problems. Do you sense any fear that this is something that you are seeing happening again, and do you have any advice for the Abe administration on how to make sure that Japan is not bypassed? Thank you.
So the greatest concern is the revisionism of the China, that is for the military expansion of China. Our assertiveness China has been expanding, and together with that, the existing the interest like territorial water, the territorial expansion by China, and for Japan, the East China Sea, the Senkaku, is such an importance, the inherent the territory. So how to protect Senkaku Islands is issue, and therefore from the Japanese the defense posture, we do have to protect the Senkaku. In South China Sea, the reclamation of the coral reef that cannot be tolerated, and that is the place where the Japan uses as a sea lane, and such a military facility is built there that may threaten Japanese the safety, and therefore Japan should collaborate with the rest of the world so that Japan should convince China to follow the rules set by the international community. And the difference between North Korea and China is that China is able to consult diplomatically. That's what we believe in. But North Korea, diplomacy cannot work. And therefore, the crisis facing us is, I think North Korea should be the top on the list, the top of the ranking. But currently, China using the force unilateral approach try to change the status quo in South the China Sea. Japan and Russia used to have a very good relations. When I was the defense minister, Japan-Russia 2+2 was first carried out. Very good relations. But at that point, the Russia carried out the unilateral the change of the status in Ukraine, and the Ukraine is a distant place from Japan. But we should not tolerate the coercive the change of status, and therefore, together with the United States, Japan carried out the economic sanction vis-a-vis Russia, and Japan-Russia, the country, the relations have been somewhat strained, but the coercive the change of status by force, I think that is a universal principle. So anything which is contrary to this, inconsistent with that, that is against a basic principle of the United States. And therefore, Japan and the United States should be firm against China to convince that the coercive or the change of status by force is not tolerable, and that China can respond to that diplomatically, I believe. And North Korean threat is immediate threat, short-term threat, and Chinese threat is, I don't know whether we can call it threat, that is the medium to long-term threat. And so we should separate the two kinds of threats. And in any case, we have a great concern about Chinese activities. And with the emergence of Trump administration, maybe I think that is our perception only, the Trump administration security and the trade issue, the Trump administration may use this as trade or the deal. And decided not to use the currency manipulator the status to China. But while that is done, in a security, the picture, if the China takes the different approach, unless that is checked constantly, over the last 2 years during the Obama administration, the artificial, the island reclamation was underway so rapidly. So we regretted it. And after the birth of the Trump administration, I may be wrong. If I may be wrong, please correct me. Freedom of navigation operation has not been carried out even once after the start of the Trump administration. While you look at the situation of China and Uti Island in South China Sea, the fighters seem to exist. Whether they are just in a training or they are formally deployed, they say that the aircrafts will not be used for military purposes. But even the military aircrafts exist there. That is a fact. And therefore, as time passes, the strategic balance seems to weigh more heavily more advantageously to China. And therefore, this is not the matter of deal. And security, it should be always the taken care for the best security interest.
On stage here and then in the front row, we have the best and brightest of Japan's national security thinkers. And the reality is we could probably get many, many more Diet members to fill the rows who would agree with what you're saying. I think there is a pretty strong consensus among political elites about Japan's strategy going forward, and people can tell me I'm wrong later, but I would even argue that among American allies, treaty allies, there's probably more consensus on strategy in Japan than there is anywhere, particularly Europe, but I'd include Korea and even maybe Australia. And that's all quite impressive. At the same time, the national security legislation was a hard legislative fight, and almost half of Japanese opposed it. Some people pointed out there are opinion polls that show if Japan were attacked, only 11 or 12% of Japanese would join the defense forces to fight, as an indication that Japan's really very passive. Of course, if you do the math, that's a 10 million man army, 20 times the current self-defense force, so that's pretty impressive, unless the people who answered are all 75 or 80 years old. So we don't know, but you do, in a way. You're at the intersection of strategy and politics. What is your sense of the Japanese broad public opinion on these security challenges, on the self-defense forum, on the defense policy reforms, on collective self-defense, on, for example, counterattack against enemy bases? Are you all way ahead of the public? Or do you think you're just in front of the public? Where's public opinion? Onodera-san. Dozo. Sorry. I have to wait for the translation.
じゃあよろしいですか。
はい。
政治の仕事というのはやはり将来を見据えて必要な政策を行うことが大事なんだと思います。実は日米の安全保障条約
I think it's very important for us politicians to work looking ahead, and then when we try to when the security, the Japan-U.S. security, the treaty was discussed, there was a huge opposition, and then there was some deaths in the protest. However, now I think hardly any the Japanese would think that there shouldn't be, or that there is no need for security the treaty. So if time goes on, we will be able to understand the importance of security legislations. And when we discussed about security legislation 2 years ago, we said that in order to counter missile attack from North Korea, not only the Aegis ship owned by Japan, but also the Aegis ship owned by United States are necessary. So if there is a huge crisis in Korea and the peninsula, and then we need to deal with a lot of the evacuees, and whether Japan alone could deal with it. So those are the examples which were presented to the public. And currently, we have this tension, the North Korean peninsula. However, with the legislation already in place, we can deal with it. So we really need to take leadership as politicians and looking ahead and put in place the necessary legislation. 2 years ago, the Democratic Party of Japan opposed against such legislation, although Mr. Maihara and myself did not agree with the party leaders, and the reason why I left the Democratic Party of Japan is because of that. But what I felt through the debate, of course, that the security, there shouldn't be too much, but security arrangements should not be too little. However, we have some trauma by doing too much in that area. However, these days, I think people really recognize that too little of security is not enough. So we really have to put necessary legislation with the discussion with public. However, at that time, 2 years ago, the opposition parties politicized this issue too much. One thing I would like to add is 2003, I think that Mr. Nakatani made reference to a contingency, the legislation 2003. And at that time, the Democratic Party of Japan and Mr. Akuma from LDP played a very important role. And we built a consensus and passed that legislation. However, 2 years ago, it didn't happen. We failed to form a political consensus. So probably the LDP should be a little was a little too arrogant, and I think they really have to listen to the opinions of opposition party in conciliatory manner, and if that kind of environment were built, then some of the opposition the party members would have agreed to that. That was rather unfortunate.
Asking questions, and you were answering questions as defense minister. Was he the best questioner because he knew so much, or was he the worst questioner because he knew so much?
知りすぎてますね。
Well, he actually knows too much. And then I think he's always one step ahead of the ruling party. So he proposes very forthcoming the proposal. However, realistically, we had to oppose against it. But there are few members of the Democratic Party of Japan who had a very progressive view. We were talking about constitutions. What's unfortunate is Democratic Party of Japan is very negative about having a discussion on the constitution, the issues. For example, just to hold the meeting is very, very difficult because they are very reluctant. And one of the members that proposed about the meeting, and that person was so criticized in the party, and he was very discouraged. So even within the party, there was not much discussion going on with regard to constitution. So for Japan, I hope that the Democratic Party of Japan should deal with this issue more seriously.
Contributors to our alliance in recent history.